this, quite a reminder that we are urgently awaiting a way forward from the Apex Court. The IEC, supported by the ANC, applying to the highest court, of course, after retired Justice Dikgang Moseneke concluded that the October local elections might not be free and fair due to pandemic restrictions. So let's discuss what the judges have to weigh up now with Professor Elmien du Plessis from the Northwest University's Faculty of Law. Prof, thank you so much for your time. So there's two issues on the table. One of them is, is the Constitutional Court the right place to be even discussing this? Some feel it should actually have gone straight to Parliament, this matter. But the bigger issue, I suppose, is Dikgang Moseneke's report that the elections might not be free and fair. That's essentially what needs to be decided. What gets decided first? I mean, in my mind, it makes sense to decide if this is the right place to hear the matter, and then they don't have to go into the second one. Is it going to work that way?
Yes, so it would be, normally a court needs to establish that they've got jurisdiction, so we call it jurisdiction to hear the matter, that it's something that falls within their powers to determine. So I would think that they deal with that matter first before they go over the question of whether it's free and fair. But I also think these two things are somehow interlinked. I think, as the previous speaker said, we know about these elections for 5 years now. It's not something that just jumped up on us. And we know we're in a pandemic for 18 months already, and we've seen other countries deal with pandemic steering voting. So you would think that the IEC at least would have started earlier with the process of saying, okay, the elections will be called at some time. So informally, it was called in April. The president said it will be on the 27th of October. So it's not a formal declaration, but it's a clear indication of when it can be expected. And they only started with the Moseneke a month or two later, if I remember correctly, which sort of negated or made it impossible to do it through a legislative process if the elections needed to be moved, because a legislative process can take fairly long, especially in this instance. Many people argue it's a foundational value of the Constitution. You need 75% of people in the National Assembly to vote for it. So that was one of the arguments also in court, where they said, well, 75% will not be reached in Parliament, and that's why you need to do it in court, which of course also raises very, very interesting philosophical questions, whether you can ask the court to force do something that Parliament would probably not have been able to do. So I think that's, on many levels, that's a very important and a very interesting question. And it's a very difficult question, because now we are a few months down the line. We sit with a situation where the elections may not be free and fair. And I think the longer nothing is happening, such as voter registrations, etc., the more likely it is that we will say that elections will not be free and fair. And the court is the guardian of the Constitution. They must make sure that the constitutional rights are protected and promoted. So the court will be in a situation where they are forced, in a sense, to say, you have forced us to now declare this not free and fair. In some senses, I do think it's due to tardiness. So I don't want to put all the blame on that. We are also in a pandemic and things are unusual. But it does seem to be sort of a creation to some extent of not forward thinking. I think that is a problem. And I think it's a very, very difficult situation for the courts to be in, because on the one hand, you want to keep the IEC and, accountable to do their work. If they've got a positive right, they must ensure free and fair elections. It's not something that they just react to. They must make plans to ensure that. So you want to keep them accountable, and on the other hand, you cannot proceed and not have free and fair elections.
It is really quite a bind. You make a point in a joint article you've written in The Conversation about the right to vote, which is ultimately central to what the Constitutional Court has to think about. And it's not just about me rocking up without my ID book after I've made sure I'm registered. There is so much around that that has to be in place to guarantee that everything has been free and fair. You talk about COVID-compliant campaigning. I'm wondering if one of the things the court has to think about is the track record of political parties and their willingness to adhere to COVID protocols. I mean, we saw protests in clear defiance of lockdown restrictions with the EFF going to the offices of SAPRA, for example. That shows they don't show much willingness to adhere to these restrictions. Are those the sorts of things that the Constitutional Court is probably right now having to consider?
Yes, so I was also thinking about all these protests, also the looting and around Zuma. There was also not a lot of compliance to protocol there, although that was not technically political campaigning. But in Burundi, for instance, they asked for relaxation of COVID rules in order to be able to do this political campaigning. So that might be one way to go around it. And other suggestions I think that was made was to say, well, the IEC has a duty to ensure that parties comply with these COVID regulations, and if they don't, they can be penalized in some way or another. So there are ways of ensuring this, but of course, once people are gathering in groups, it's difficult. We are also not very good in South Africa with crowd control and things, so it might be difficult to enforce that, which might lead to more infection. So I think there's merit in that fear there. But I also think that, you know, after 18 months, I think Professor de Kortse from UNISA, he wrote an article that said, you know, after 18 months, we all had to adjust somehow in the way that we do things, and parties can adjust in the way that they campaign. And that might mean that, you know, they need to campaign in smaller groups. They need to campaign only outside. So there are ways of ensuring that even campaigning is in compliance with COVID regulations.
I mean, as you mentioned earlier, time is absolutely of the essence, but the highest court of the land is dealing with complex and quite unprecedented matters as we speak with this looming deadline. Is there any indication of when they're going to make a decision? Any sign at all?
I think that's the million-dollar question. I've read somewhere, but I couldn't confirm that somebody said on Friday, but I don't want to spread rumors without being able to confirm it. So, you know, what the court can also do, I think ideally it would have been good if they could have given a judgment on Monday already before the registration closed, just to give clarity there. The court can, of course, give a judgment without reason, so they can say this is what we decided. We will provide reasons later, but in the interest of this being quite an urgent matter, which is going to give clarity on whether the elections go ahead or not. And I do think, and that's now my observation, that the longer it takes, the more likely it is that the elections will be postponed. So I would think, and it's highly unusual for the Constitutional Court also to hear these urgent matters and to have to, you know, give judgment that this quickly. But I do think it should be by the end of this week, because the time is really running out. And I think it's important to get clarity. If it's going ahead, you know, there might be the need to make provision for some sort of registration weekend, for instance, though it's not legislatively obligatory, so we don't have to do it. But I think that is part of a right to free and fair election. So all those kind of things still need to happen before the election, apart from all the other party things, of course, that must happen.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Northwest University Law Professor Elmien du Plessis there, saying that we need to hear from the Constitutional Court ideally before the end of the week or by the end of the week. Time is running out. Still